All right, we're going to make a dynamic API-driven single-page application using VueJS. And first thing we're going to do is serve our app. And we're going to do that in the index.js file. Before we get started, I just want to say, if you ever feel yourself getting confused, try to just follow along with what we're trying to do, the general idea of it, and don't get bogged down with syntax or trying to memorize specific ways to do things. You can always play around with the code and pick up on that stuff gradually. The important thing is just following the general logic of what we're doing. So let's just jump into it. First thing we're going to do is import Vue from Vue, then import Vue router from Vue router, and these give us access to the VueJS library along with the Vue router library, two things that we're going to be using. And we're going to do vue.use Vue router. That tells Vue that we're using Vue router and kind of links up things. Then we're going to create a component. Let's create test component equals template. Let's create a div. If you're not familiar with HTML, a div is just a container. So in that container, I'm going to say this. Why don't I say we rendered our first route? Great, that'll be exciting to see. And then let's do routes. Let's define our routes. Create an array, and we're just going to have one element in our array right now, an object, and it's going to have a path. Let's do the path of test. Sounds good. And then the component for this route is going to be our test component. Great. So we have our test component. We have our routes. Now we can instantiate our router equals new Vue router. And we'll pass in our routes. So now we've created our router, and it knows about our routes. There's only one of them, and the route links up to this component we made. So what's left? Let's make our app. Do app equals new Vue. We're going to pass in our router to this app, so it has the router. We're going to mount to app. Okay, so this is where I thought some people might get confused. This is something, if you're getting bogged down, you can just copy and paste this and worry about it later. But what's basically happening is we're creating a new view, passing in the router, and we're mounting it to the HTML element that has the ID of app. So let's look at the HTML. Okay, pretty standard HTML page. And here's a div with an ID of app. So our app is going to render in here. So let's start building it up. First thing we gotta do, let's throw in a router link. This is how we're going to actually set the route. And so we make an HTML element, router link, and then we set the to attribute. We're going to set that to link to the route of test. And we'll say go to test. And then we'll close this router link. Cool. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, you know what? That's going to bother me. Let me throw in... What is that? You can ignore these. These are just to make this stuff not show up while I'm doing this. Let's get back to it. Okay, so what happened? We created this link. And look, if you're not familiar with routers, this is what's happening. It's adding this slash test at the end, and that means we're on the route of test, and we will render whatever component is set to render. But hey, wait a minute, it's not showing we rendered our first route. That's because we're setting the route, but in our HTML, we do not have this necessary element of the router view. Once we put that in there, we'll be in business. Oh yeah, we rendered our first route. Is it as exciting as you thought? Should be pretty underwhelming because I said we were going to make a dynamic application, and this is not dynamic at all. It's completely hard-coded. So let's start making it dynamic. What we're going to do is in this path, we make a colon, and that says let's make a variable. So when you go to /test, test becomes a variable in the container, or like it's the value of the variable model, right? So model is a kind of a container variable, and it gets set to whatever goes here. So this should still just render the same, but we have this variable in the background that we're not making use of. I'm gonna say right now, we don't want to do this. We don't want to write a component like this. We're gonna write a new component, and you know what? We gotta make a new file. I'm gonna make a file called indexPageGenerator.js. So now we have a new JavaScript file, and I want to link up to indexPageGenerator. That's what's gonna be rendered when we go to any path after our route. And we can't just do this. We have to import it. Not too bad. All you do is import indexPageGenerator from indexPageGenerator.js. Great. So now we're pulling whatever code is in indexPageGenerator.js into our main app, which is already being served. So we're well on the way to making something worthwhile. So let's build out indexPageGenerator. I am going to, let's just start off with the basics here. Export default, and then let's do so that's, you just need that, okay? Let's just know that you need that. And so that creates the shell for our app, and we're going to put template here to define our template, and we can use the backtick to create multi-line strings, which is pretty nice. And let's do what we were doing before. Make a div container, serve this well. Let's say our current route is, let's just make sure that works. Oh, great, it does. Beautiful. So we're loading indexPageGenerator and rendering it just like we were rendering our old test component. We're rendering it when we go to the test. Here's where it starts to get a little more interesting, is we can do, if you want to render a variable in the HTML, we can do these double curly braces. The variable I want to render is this.route.params. That part you're just gonna have to memorize, but you know, just look it up when you need it. You don't have to memorize it, whatever. And do you remember the variable we decided was model? So if we look at route params.model, what should this say? It should say our current route is, name of our route, test. Oh, it worked. Okay. Still not dynamic. Well, I guess, you know what? This is dynamic. We got dynamic down. Let's make it API driven. That's where it gets really exciting. Trust me. Hold on. So to handle the API calls, I want to just import Axios from Axios. That's what I use to make HTTP calls. I don't know if it's the best thing. There's other things. You can use fetch. That's the native. For this we're going to use this Axios, okay? So next, we want to set up our data. I'm just going to make 2 containers here for the data we're going to fetch. And let's see, we'll make one called models. We'll make another one called messages. You can name those whatever you want. That's what I came up with. Okay, so mount. Yeah, let me be clear. These aren't special names. I mean, these are names I selected. So, but data, that is special. Template, that's special. I'll try to remember to point those things out, but I think you're following. So we're gonna do mounted. I should explain this. This is kind of special. This is when our component, this index page generator, mounts. When it loads, we are going to run whatever code's in here. So what code do we want in here? We want our API call. So we're going to do axios.get, and then we could be calling out to any API. We could be calling out to Google, Twitter, Facebook. I'm going to call out to this JSON placeholder. They have a nice mock API, which is great for learning. Check them out. You can go to this website, read all about it. But anything after this is their API address. So what I'm going to do, and this is where it gets dynamic. We're going to hit whatever API route that whatever route we're on is the API route we're going to hit. It'll kind of make sense. Just stick with me. We're just copying this. This dynamically changes based on, make sure this works. Okay, see how that changed? This would become hello if this is hello. We only have a link to test though right now. Hope that's making sense. But we wrote this API call. Okay, for people that aren't familiar with like asynchronous stuff, we can't just say what to do with the data as soon as we get it, because a web page, when you go to a web page, it might take a second to load. At least takes a few milliseconds to load. So instead of just saying this equals something or something like that, we got to do we got to do a dot then, which says whenever this page does finally load and we get our results, do this with the results. So we do results equals so with the result of this API call, I want to do this dot messages. That's this little container I made here. We're going to do results dot data. So instead of doing our current route as test, let's say response is messages. See what that looks like. Okay, so the reason that we're just getting an empty array is because this site, its API has no route of test or hello or let's just ignore that. But it has no route of test. So we need to create a new link a new route that links up to a route they do have. And just off the top of my head, I know they have a route called users. So I'm going to go to users. So I'm going to refresh this. So when we click go to users, whoa, okay. See, now it's starting to get exciting, right? Because we didn't hard code any of this. This is coming dynamically from another website. This data could change every time we load our page. Who knows? When a new user is created, it might show up in this list. But that's the basic idea. I mean, if you were working with the Twitter API, maybe you're showing the results of some hashtag or something like that. But we have this rendering, but it's still, I mean, this does not look good at all. This is just raw data. So let's just clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to make a table, right? And I have Bootstrap loaded. That's a styling library. So we're going to make this table look a little nicer so it doesn't look like it's a website from the 90s. We add in this class of table striped. I'm a big fan of table striped. Now, it can be divisive, but we're using it. So what do we need in a table? We need a T-body. And then within that, I'm going to get rid of that. Within our table body, we need a table row. Within a table row, we need a cell. Great. Okay, so what do we want to do exactly? We want to display, we have an array of users right now, and we want to list one user per row. So on this table row element, we're going to do v4, which is a built-in view directive that lets us loop through data in the HTML. So what I'm going to do is message in messages, because our messages gets filled with the response. We're going to loop through each one, make a temporary local variable called message, and then we're going to render message in our cell. So still it's going to be an ugly table if you're kind of skipping ahead here, because it's going to be one cell per row, but should be better. Let's just take a look at what it looks like. Right? That looks better, right? One user per row, but it still looks like we're just raw data. And so, what can we do? Well, you know what? Let me show you this real quick, because maybe it seems like it took a lot of work to get to this step, but let me show you how we can kind of because it's dynamic and because it's API driven, we can accomplish a lot really quickly now. So if we create a new route called posts, we can say go to posts. We'll make a new link. So now we can go to users. Oh, you know what? Okay, here's one of those things where I don't want you to get bogged down in the syntax, but basically, because this is one component, it's not getting reloaded. We're not hitting this mounted. This data, this isn't running every time we switch routes right now, which is unfortunate. The way to address that is we add in this little key, bind the key to the full path. I don't want to get too into that. Just know you could copy and paste this. There might be some performance concerns depending on what you're doing. But for now, this is how we're going to get around this. Let me rerun it so we can see. Here's our users. Here's our posts. That's pretty cool, right? We have two tables. But the reason I wanted to create this new route link is because what we could do is we could hard code some table headers in. We could say we want an ID column, we want a name column, but then it wouldn't really work for posts. I mean ID, but there's also user ID, there's title. Users doesn't have that. So what if we just want to render this data, just have the index page generator figure out what columns to make? Well, if that's what you were hoping for, you're in luck, because I'm gonna make that's what we're gonna do. All right. So I bet you were curious why I made this container models. Well, now it's coming into play. Let's do this.models equals object.keys. This grabs the keys, as in ID, name, username, from a piece of data, and I'm going to do this dot messages. Let's just look at the first message. If you're a professional, you might think this is bad, and probably is. There's probably a better way to do it, but that's the way we're doing it for now. We're just looking at the first result and grabbing the keys from it. So now we have this dot models. We have our models. We have the keys and we're grabbing them dynamically based on the results of the API call. Very important. So now we're going to do a t-head, closing tag, and so in here we looped through the rows and generated a procedural number of rows based on how many results we had. For the headers, we're going to do very similar. We're going to create a v4. We're going to loop through key in models. Models being this, which populated by our keys. You know what I could have called this keys? I didn't. So, like I said, you can name it whatever you want. So now we're going to show each key. Let's just see what that looks like. Oh yeah, that looks way better, doesn't it? I mean, this is kind of suspect, but this is good. Got headers. And if we go to posts, look, the headers change. Nice. So dynamic. We got dynamic, API driven, but still pretty raw single page application here. Let's just take it one step further. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, is if we, I'm going to make this multi-line here. So we looped through here to get each message in messages. I'm going to loop through each cell so we can create as many cells as there are headers or columns, so we can split up this data. So again, this might not be the best way to do it, but this is the way we're going to do it, is we have a nested for loop situation. And we do v4 key in models, and if we just left this as message, I mean, let's see if you can guess what would happen. It's just filling each one with all this raw data. If we want to pick out, okay, we have an ID. I just want, what's the value of ID? Just show that. What we do is we look in the message, and we can use array syntax. Just put this little array bracket after message, and we do key. So it's going to take whatever the key is that we looped through and grab that value from message. So let's see what this looks like. Oh yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, I mean, there's some problem areas we could look into, but overall, we've got something here. Posts, and you know what? We could go, we could add more routes, but it looks like something's locking up for me, so I'm just going to end this here. I think you have the idea. Since this is a Scrimble lesson, you can go in and actually add more routes yourself. If you check out this JSON placeholder.typecode.com, you'll see they have some other routes like comments and stuff. You can make some more routes and see new pages generate. You could also style this maybe as a side nav bar or a top nav bar. Lots of stuff we could do, but I hope you get the idea of how to make a dynamic API-driven single-page application using VueJS. Thank you and good luck.